China never tried to invade an overseas territory. My own view, I don't mean to be flip about it, but the militarization of the South China Sea, to my mind, is a defensive reaction to the U.S. Navy, not a provocation by China. How would America like if China declared that the U.S. can't reach the Caribbean because there's a first island chain to prevent the U.S. from reaching the Atlantic Ocean? Are you kidding?
If you watch Western news, you often hear the same message. China is becoming the next great military threat. We are told China wants to dominate the world, that it's preparing to replace the United States as the next global superpower. But here's a simple question. If China is really an expansionist country, where's the evidence? Because when you look beyond the headlines, China's actions don't always match the narrative. That's exactly what economist Professor Jeffrey Sachs argues. He believes many Western leaders see China through lens of their own history, assuming China wants to build a global empire simply because previous great powers did. Here's what he had to say.
China never wanted overseas empires. It never bothered this region, really, for thousands of years. China was the all-powerful hegemon of Asia for at least the last millennium up until the 19th century. And amazingly, and I'll take it from the end of the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols, from 1368 up until 1839 when the British invaded China. From 1368 to 1869, China never tried to invade an overseas territory. And China did invade Vietnam once in 1410 AD. And there was a 16-year war, 1410 to 1426. That's all. In Europe, everybody fought everyone else every year. I don't think there was a quiet year in Europe. They were at war nonstop, the British and the French for hundreds of years. And this is a very big difference. China did something unimaginable in 1434. It had the biggest naval fleet in the whole world. It commanded the Indian Ocean. It could reach East Africa. It could have discovered the Americas. It could have circled the Cape of Good Hope. It could have crossed the Pacific. It could have done all those things. Instead, the Mandarin court of the Ming Dynasty ended it, said, what do we need ships for? We have everything here. And our big problem is coming from the north, coming from the steppe region. So we better defend against the steppe region. And even China's expansion in the 18th century, during Qianlong's rule as emperor, was not really Chinese. It was Manchu victories over the Mongols, over Xinjiang and over Tibet. But that was a fight within the steppe region, countries, not peoples, not Han Chinese invasion abroad. I think the history of the Chinese tributary system is China wanted respect, always. If you bow down to the emperor as the celestial ruler, that was enough. China didn't really ask for material tribute, unequal trade, extraction of resources, colonies, land, conquests, never. Now, does that prove that China would not? Almost, in my view. China's got enough things to do with its 1.4 billion population, and it's boxed in on three sides, pretty much making it very difficult to do anything else. So I'm not very worried. My own view, I don't mean to be flip about it, but the militarization of the South China Sea, to my mind, is a defensive reaction to the U.S. Navy, not a provocation by China. The US flaunts the idea of choke points on China's sea lanes. It flaunts them. It's in our textbooks. The first island chain is an invention of John Foster Dulles in the early 1950s. How would America like if China declared that the US can't reach the Caribbean because there's a first island chain to prevent the US from reaching the Atlantic Ocean? Are you kidding? But that's American formal policy. This is really not right thinking in this world. So when China responds, I understand why China responds. And I think we should stay out of the way. Of course, China does not then have freedom to abuse the rest, but frankly, why would China? They don't need colonies, land. They do need trading partners and places for investment, and that's good. That's a win-win proposition. So I personally believe in a peaceful region here that is not dependent on US policing. I think the US makes the noise, but I don't think it helps the peace personally. This is my own view.
Professor Jeffrey Sachs makes a really important point. A lot of people assume that because China is becoming more powerful economically, it must also want to dominate the world militarily. But is that assumption actually backed by facts? Let's start with something very simple. If a country genuinely wants to become a global military empire, you'd expect it to constantly invade other countries, overthrow governments, station troops around the world, and build military alliances everywhere, right? That's how most historical empires expanded. But when you look at China today, that's simply not what you see. Over the last 4 decades, China has focused overwhelmingly on growing its economy. Instead of sending soldiers overseas, it has been building factories. Instead of exporting wars, it has been exporting manufactured goods. Instead of creating military alliances across the globe, it has been signing trade agreements and investing in infrastructure. Whether you like China's political system or not, its biggest national project hasn't been military conquest. It's been economic development. Just think about what China has spent the last 40 years doing. It lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It built the world's largest high-speed rail network. It became the world's biggest manufacturing hub. It invested heavily in renewable energy, electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, and advanced technology. These are the priorities of a country trying to become richer, not necessarily one preparing to conquer the world. Now, compare that with the image we are constantly shown. According to many Western politicians and media outlets, China is an aggressive power that's ready to invade everyone. But if that's true, why doesn't its global military footprint reflect that? China currently has just one acknowledged overseas military support base, located in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa. The United States, on the other hand, maintains hundreds of military facilities spread across more than 80 countries. Again, this isn't about saying one country is good and the other is bad. It's simply pointing out that countries reveal their priorities through where they spend their money and where they deploy their resources. Military empires usually build military networks. Trading nations usually build economic networks, right? When China expands overseas, what do we usually hear about? New ports, railways, industrial parks, power plants, fiber optic cables, trade corridors. These projects are certainly controversial in some countries, and there are legitimate debates about debt, transparency, and political influence. But they are fundamentally different from military occupation. Building a railway isn't the same thing as sending in an army. Building a port isn't the same thing as establishing military rule. Yet, these two very different forms of influence are often presented as if they are exactly the same. Another thing that's often overlooked is China's own history and national priorities today. For most of modern history, China's biggest security concerns haven't been thousands of miles away. They have been much closer to home. Economic stability, domestic development, energy security, food security, technological self-reliance, and maintaining stability for a population of more than 1.4 billion people. A government responsible for that many people has enormous domestic challenges before it even begins thinking about projecting power globally. That's one reason why China's leadership repeatedly talks about development as its top priority. Whether people believe those statements or not, the country's investments largely reflect that focus. Of course, critics often point to Taiwan or South China Sea as proof that China is expansionist. These are serious issues, and nobody should pretend they aren't. But it's also important to distinguish between regional territorial disputes and global military expansion. Those aren't the same thing. Many countries, including major powers, have territorial disputes with their neighbors. Calling every territorial dispute evidence of a plan for world domination oversimplifies an incredibly complex geopolitical reality. This is where the public conversation often becomes misleading. Instead of discussing China's actual capabilities and intentions, the debate is sometimes driven by fear. Every new Chinese technology is described as a threat. Every infrastructure project is portrayed as a strategic debt trap. Every economic success becomes evidence of an inevitable military takeover. It's almost as if China's rise itself is treated as suspicious. But perhaps the real reason is much simpler. For more than 2 centuries, the international system has largely been shaped by Western powers. Now, for the first time in modern history, a non-Western country has become a serious economic competitor. That's a major shift. Whenever the balance of power changes, uncertainty naturally follows. History shows us that established powers often become anxious when new powers emerge. That doesn't automatically mean conflict is inevitable, nor does it mean the rising power intends to repeat the exact same path taken by the previous empires. This is why it's important to separate evidence from assumptions. We should not judge China based on what we fear it might do someday. We should judge it based on what it is actually doing today, right? And today, China's greatest source of influence isn't aircraft carriers. It's manufacturing, it's trade, it's infrastructure, it's technology, it's investment. None of this proves that China will always remain peaceful. No one can predict the future, but it does challenge one of the most common narratives we hear, that China is somehow destined to become the next global military empire simply because it has become wealthy. History doesn't automatically repeat itself. Different civilizations have different experiences, different priorities, and different ways of pursuing national power. As the world becomes more multipolar, perhaps the biggest mistake we can make is assuming that every rising power must behave exactly like the ones that came before it. Maybe the real question isn't whether China is trying to conquer the world. Maybe it's whether we have been taught to see China's rise through a lens that no longer reflects the reality of today's world. If you found this perspective interesting, let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you believe China is truly expansionist? Or do you think the narrative has been exaggerated? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss future videos. Thank you for watching.